What's the difference between a recovery home and a sober living environment? The main difference between a recovery home and a sober living environment is the level of care and support that's provided. A sober living environment is a home that is occupied by other alcoholics and addicts that are in recovery and who are there as a support and companionship, just as you are to them. Sober living environments have general guidelines, but usually don't provide all-inclusive services beyond providing a safe and sober living situation. So, for example, homes that the sober living homes, sober living environments, and sometimes they're called different. And for example, a home that is $150 or $200 a week, typically those are set up more like sober living environments. And when it comes down to it, $150 or $200 a week is not really enough money to provide anything more than a sober living environment. And sober living environments are, there's a sober living environment or sober living house or halfway house situation for every single person out there. Everybody has a different budget. And for one person, a sober living environment might be perfect. Just being around a bunch of other people that are in recovery, that are working a 12-step program, that are doing the next right thing, that want to stay clean and sober. Those can be really effective. My experience with a sober living environment like that is that it's more like rolling the dice, and you're throwing a dart. You don't know if you're going to get into a good situation, because many times in a sober living environment, there's not necessarily house managers that are W-2 employees that are paid to hold the residents accountable to working a 12-step program, staying clean and sober. Like in a recovery home, I'm going to get to a recovery home, but in a sober living environment, they're not doing all of the things that a recovery home is doing. So there's just a higher level of accountability, a higher level of support, and it's more like I said, rolling the dice. And if you get into a good, solid community of people that want to be clean and sober, a sober living environment can be a great thing. But as soon as you have one person in that sober living environment that starts drinking, starts using, doesn't want to be clean and sober, the relapse before the relapse happens, it's not caught by somebody else, then that the entire house, it'll take the entire house down. That's what happens, is that in an environment or a sober living environment where one person can take the whole house down. As they say, one bad apple spoils the whole bunch. And typically sober living environments, they accept payments weekly, and they're more like revolving doors. And with a revolving door, you never know who's going to be there. And with a recovery home, typically, and again, I'll get to the recovery home, but typically with recovery homes, it's more of a stable environment. And typically people are going to pay for at least 1 month at a time. So 1 month or 2 months or even 3 months at a time. So you have a much more stable environment, which is more conducive to somebody that wants to be clean and sober. So a recovery home, on the other hand, is more structured, offers a higher level of accountability, support, structure. It's a higher level of care than a sober living environment. These extra services can include simple yet strict guidelines that promote harmonious communal living, mental health support. Many times, mental health, someone with mental illness can be supported in a recovery home, whereas a sober living environment might not be appropriate. So extra services can include things also like life skills coaching, sober companions, sober transport, crisis intervention when necessary. The main goal of a recovery home is to take the worries of daily minutia off the shoulders of the clients so that they can focus on healing and focus on their recovery. However, clients are expected to follow guidelines. Typically, the guidelines much stricter than in just a standard sober living environment. And for example, out of bed by 8 o'clock, bed's made, chores done, the home is immaculate, no TV from 9 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. It's a requirement that everybody in the home has a purpose so that they're not sitting around the house smoking cigarettes and watching Judge Judy all day. So that might be acceptable in a sober living environment, whereas in a recovery home, that's not going to be tolerated, which in my experience, those types of behaviors or activities, not having a purpose, is not conducive to recovery. If somebody's sitting around inside their own head, that's going to lead to a relapse. That's going to lead back to the drink, back to the drug. So the cost is higher typically in a recovery home because for many reasons, the expenses are higher. It's not just because a recovery home wants to charge more money, their expenses are higher. And for example, house managers might not, are probably not just the most senior resident. So that's another thing with a sober living environment. The house manager might be, typically is going to be somebody like the most sober person in the house, which could be less than 30 days, is the house manager. They get free rent. They also have a job. They also have to do other things besides be the house manager. There might not be a thorough vetting process. There is probably not a thorough training process either. Whereas with a recovery home, there's a vetting process for the house managers. The house managers are full-time W-2 employees. Their full-time job is to facilitate recovery at the home and hold the clients and the residents accountable to the rules of the home. There's also a zero tolerance policy, which is caught at a recovery home because you have the staffing in place to, I guess, police it, for lack of a better term. And that type of support might not be available at a sober living environment. So there are multiple layers available for support and accountability at a recovery home, including full house managers that are full-time W-2 employees, a program director, recovery coaches, sober companions, and so forth. So there's just more people available for support and to help people stay on their path to recovery. And every single person that goes to whether it's a sober living environment or a recovery home, they all want to be clean and sober at one point. And then something happens, they become triggered, and next thing you know, they don't want to be clean and sober anymore. They're like, fuck it, I'm out of here. And in a recovery home, there are more people available to provide support to get that person back on their path to recovery and hopefully prevent a relapse. Also at a recovery home, things like gym memberships are available. Food and meals are many times provided at recovery homes. Technology assisted care. So Camelback Recovery, we utilize technology assisted care, which again is just another layer of accountability and support.